make sure I can. I think I figured this out. Oh, there we go. Can you guys see that?
You can.
Okay. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Mennonites and their migration to America as redemptioners and then westward expansion. So a lot of people confuse redemptioners with indentured servants. Indentured servant Indentured servant debts for travel were typically negotiated and approved by a magistrate or other official. They were also predominantly single males who agreed to work for several years to obtain passage to America. Redemptioners' voyage debts weren't organized in official capacity. Rather, it was an agreement between sailing companies and those wishing to travel. Some paid for travel prior to, while others after arriving. They often brought their immediate families and sometimes multiple generations to America with them. So that's kind of the basic difference between a lot of times there's the mixing up of those when you're talking about immigrants arriving, but there is that basic difference. So again, redemptioners and their payment for travels. Redemptioners were European immigrants, but typically not English, of varying ethnicity and religions that received passage to America, and typically that passage meant they arrived in Pennsylvania by either paying or selling themselves to ship owners for the cost of travel to America. Some ship owners would throw not only the property of redemptioners overboard during inclement weather, but the redemptioners themselves. So, the basically redemptioners were not treated well because they didn't have to account with any kind of leadership that was paying for their cost to travel. Many paid for their travels prior to leaving Europe. However, during voyage or once in the American harbor, some cruel ship owners held them hostage and demanded more money. They would keep them prisoner on board the ship until they paid or signed contracts to work off the debt. Those who signed contracts would be released off the ship typically, but would have to stay within that area and pay for their passage. Those passages were often sold off to other companies. Of the redemptioners, one of the larger groups were the Swiss, Swiss and German Mennonites in Europe. Um, a little history on the Mennonites in Europe, just as a background, is that in the 17th century, the Swiss government and many of its citizens were inflicting severe persecution on Mennonites living within the country. That persecution included huge fines and taxes on their properties, killing, maiming, and torturing, brutal terror, setting their property, which included homes, businesses, and religious buildings, on fire, imprisonment with lack of food and water until dying, or giving up their religion. So, hopefully, can you see the little map on there? If you can see the map, that's kind of a quick map of the basic movement of the Swiss and German Mennonites through Europe. Again, they were in Swiss first, and then to escape that, they ended up moving down or over, I should say, to France and then up to the Netherlands. And then ultimately, a large group of them ended up in the Palatinate, where they stayed until other persecutions began happening. About that same time, back in England, William Penn and the Mennonite migration to America started occurring. And that was basically the result of, in 1681, King Charles II gave William Penn a large chunk of land in America to settle a debt that he owed Penn's father. So, William Penn's father was in the military and had done extensive favors and other things for the king. Well, after he died, to sort of, for lack of a better word, save face in the public's eye, he needed to somehow pay back those debts. In the meantime, his son, William Penn, was kind of a troublemaker in King Charles' eyes. He was the leader of the Quakers, and the Quakers obviously did not coincide well with the king's agenda. So after jailing him for quite a few times, he decided that to pay back his debt and get rid of William Penn from England, he would give William Penn a large chunk of money in America. Large chunk of land in America. It turns out that that land was the largest land offering in the country's history. It served two things. It repaid his debt, and it got rid of William Penn, or so he thought. So William Penn ultimately moved over there, not only to set up his Quaker colonies in the land given to him, but he also set aside property for other peaceful religions, including the Mennonites of Europe. So he asked them to come over to Pennsylvania, named ironically after Penn, and they set up their own little colony outside the city. There was a German town, and then there was also farmers to the west of that. So the Swiss and German Mennonites arriving in America, again, typically they arrived as redemptioners in America. William Penn, although he offered them cheap land sales, was not paying for their passage. Sometimes they were sold by the ship owners, much like the African American slaves of the day were. You can see to the right there that there's an advertisement by a gentleman who brought these people over and was selling them to people as, whatever jobs they could do to pay back those debts. So once they arrived in America, again, most of them were arriving in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. After arriving in Philadelphia and disembarking ships, Swiss and German Mennonites stayed within the city until paying off their voyage debts. Those who had no debt from travel spent some time in the city preparing and obtaining goods to settle outside of the city on property set aside and purchased from William Penn. The poorest of those arriving, or those who had sailing debts to pay, congregated and often lived by camping in the same spot that the historic Philadelphia City Hall was constructed later. Although some stayed in the city and became business owners, most relocated to Germantown or Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Moving from the city was done by wagon, horse, or walking on undeveloped, rough, and often Indian trails. Zach, could you please go take care of that? Sorry, I'm sending my son after the dogs. Zach. The Hans Christian Her House in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. So this is actually the oldest Mennonite home in our country's history, and it still stands. It was built by some of the earliest Swiss-German Mennonite immigrant families to arrive in Pennsylvania under William Penn's land sales. Hans Christian Herr was a Mennonite community leader. He was one of the Mennonites who met with William Penn to negotiate a portion of Penn's land that was set aside for Mennonites. The building still stands and is the oldest original Mennonite meeting house in the Western Hemisphere. It served as both a home for Hanser as well as a place of worship for the Mennonites in the area. Today, the building and property have been restored and are part of a museum. After settling in Pennsylvania, of course, there was some migration that later went on. Migration of Mennonites from Pennsylvania to Virginia. As tensions arose in the country between the colonies and England, pressure on the Mennonite communities from both the state of Pennsylvania and citizens escalated. The Mennonites were forced to decide between enlisting to fight in the Revolutionary War or pay a fine. Some could not afford the fine and enlisted, while others paid the fines due. Social and religious pressures continued to be placed on Mennonites in Pennsylvania even after the war. The Pennsylvania state constitution, when written, did not grant the Mennonites state rights or protections. As a result, many left Pennsylvania and relocated to Virginia, where they settled in the Appalachian Mountains and continued to successfully farm. Virginia's state constitution granted them freedom of religion as well as state constitutional rights. From Virginia, many of them ended up moving elsewhere. Most of these people that were moving were farmers, very successful farmers. So a lot of them moved from the Appalachian Mountains over to Kentucky, where the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers were providing a lot of the necessary waters for farming. And from there, a lot of them went up to Ohio and Indiana and then farther west. So, some interesting tidbits about Mennonites in our history. Those in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, are credited with developing the Conestoga wagon, which played a significant part in American history. They used the wagons to transport their goods from their farms to cities for commerce. There are approximately 2.1 million Mennonites in 87 countries in the world. 32% are in North America, 35% in Africa, 20% in Asia, 10% in the Caribbean and Latin America, and 3% in Europe. So if you look at that, you know, Europe has changed quite a bit, but even after all these years, only 3% are remaining there versus other locations of the world. Today, there is Goshen College, which is a private coeducational institution in Goshen, Indiana. It's actually a Mennonite liberal arts college. So, what do the Mennonite redemptioners have to do with genealogy in the Yakima Valley? We have descendants of Hans Christian Herr in the Yakima Valley. They were early pioneers that settled along the Upper Tanum and elsewhere in the county. Descendants of the Hans Christian Herr family in the Yakima Valley. So these photos came from the Yakima Valley Museum as well as one of the descendants. So one of them is William Charles Blanker and Mary Rebecca Conway Blanker. So they are, William is to my left and Mary's to the right. William Charles Blanker and Mary's father were steamboat owners and captains who ran the blockades at Vicksburg on their first boat, the Forest Queen. So their boat, the Forest Queen, was a private steamship that was commandeered by Grant and his troops, and William actually had himself and his crew run those versus military people. William and Mary moved to the Atanum area with their children after the war. Mary was one of the original founders of the Women's Century Club in Yakima. So William and Mary, they had two daughters that also moved out here with them. One was Nellie Marie Blanker Hibbler Sassoon. Again, she was the daughter of William and Mary. She was married once, but her husband had passed. Her second husband was also a Civil War soldier. He was the last Grand Army of the Republic Meade Post Number 9 member to live and be buried in Tahoma Cemetery. Several of the grandchildren are still living today. In fact, Donna, who donated a lot of these pictures, is one of those grandchildren. The other sister or daughter of theirs that's remained living was Gertrude Blanker Dills. She married Mr. I.H. Dills, and they owned the I.H. Dills clothing store in Yakima. And if you've ever looked at Yakima's historic clothing stores from long ago, the Dills clothing store was one of the fancier, popular stores to go to. So the Dills lived in a home at the corner of 16th and Yakima Avenue. And if you can see that photo, that house, I believe, is still standing. That would have been their house that they built. That's it. That's the end. Thank you. Um, I think we still have time. If so, um, we can open up for questions, maybe.
Great.
Hello.
Unmute yourselves. Yep. Unmute yourselves to ask questions. Ed, do you have one? No.
Well, yeah, I do actually.
Actually, I lost you guys here. Oh, there we go. Let me pull you up just a second. Okay, there you go. Sorry.
Great.
Was the attraction to the Yakima Valley the farming opportunities here?
Yes and no. For the Blankers, that family actually became one of the biggest steamboat pilot families along the Mississippi from prior to the Civil War to after the Civil War. They had packets of steamboats. They were very wealthy. They moved out after he retired for his health purposes, like a lot of the people that moved west trying to seek a climate that was a little better for his health. He, I want to say that he lived less than 3 years after they relocated.
Wow. Wow. Huh. They never had boats on the Columbia River?
No.
No.
So they were, steamboating long before on the Mississippi, but long before they were steamboating on the Columbia. And by the time he moved out, he was older.
Are there still Mennonites in the Yakima Valley?
I believe so. Is it the Men? I think there's some Mennonites in the lower valley, or no, that's the Hutterites. Sorry, they're very similar. Um, the Mennonites now, if I remember correctly, more modern. Like I kind of stopped researching them a lot after the family that I talked about. I'm actually writing a book on, so I kind of stopped researching them at a point after the family moved out west. But that family that I talked about, actually, the other thing that happened is a lot of people in Virginia that were Mennonites. In the Appalachians, they had circuit court writers of different religions, and the social and religious pressures were still being applied to them tremendously, as well as the Quakers. So a lot of them began, converting. Their kids began marrying into different religions. By the time this family moved from Virginia to Kentucky, and the whole family moved, grandparents, aunts, uncles, they had all converted um, out of being a Mennonite. Not that they disliked it. They still had some Mennonite family back in those areas, but they had converted, I believe, to Methodism.
There's aren't there a group of Mennonites that live in the Kittitas Valley? There's a
Yes. I don't
store.
know if they're, yeah. Are
I
they
don't know if
Hutterite or
they're
Mennonite?
Yeah, I'm not sure what's, but it's sort of a related kind of religion. They seem,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the dress seems to be the same, that kind of thing. The women
Yes.
wear the long dresses and the little bonnets and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yes.
there's a little store as you're driving into Ellensburg on the main drag, that main street. It goes
Mm-hmm.
through Ellensburg, north, south to north. Uh, Maybe about a half a mile after you get off the freeway on your right. I think it's called the Daily Mercantile or something like that. They have all kinds of fresh baking goods and
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
you can get killer deals on oatmeal and
Oh,
flour.
yum.
Yeah, no, it's you got to kind of look for the sign because it's just in a little strip mall off to the east of the main street.
I'll have to go up there and look. I go up there quite a bit to Central, but I've never stopped there. I'll have to do that.
Yeah.
Ellen, I'm curious, how did the transition, I mean, obviously the people who came across and, were treated really roughly on the boats. But once they got to Pennsylvania, were they supported? I mean, that you said that no. So even though William Penn invited them, they weren't really welcomed. They were just tolerated.
So after a certain amount of time, so you had a bunch of different people arriving in Pennsylvania. You had Germans, you had Swiss, you had different religions as well. So basically, William Penn's area was kind of used as an escape area for people who were being persecuted by England.
Hmm.
You know, England back then, sent anything from prisoners to, Catholics over, right? If they didn't correspond with what the king wanted. So there were large amounts of English and other people over there. They were not all Quakers. They were not all, Mennonites. There were a lot of English there too. And we have to remember that during that time, America was still under English rule.
Okay.
So they didn't like, as the Quakers and some of the other groups like the Mennonites became more and more successful in business and farming, they didn't like more and more, and this through the years it's just a different ethnic group, right? They didn't like them coming because now they're competition. And now their religion is different. And so pretty soon that's why they got so mad when they wouldn't fight in the Revolutionary War for England. Because they were a peaceful people. So that really kicked off even more persecution. They started actually, and even when they got off the boats, they started instantly taxing them versus other immigrants that were coming over.
So
It
that's
was really,
west,
yeah.
or
Was that?
that's why they were pressured to move west. I mean, that was that part of the motivation.
That was part of it. I mean, there's still some there, but a good portion of them moved to Virginia because of that. Because after the war, Pennsylvania said you have no state rights. Here you are paying taxes, but you don't have state rights because you're not defending the country. And when they moved to Virginia in the Appalachians, for many years it was like an isolated area, and they were fine. And Virginia actually gave them constitutional rights, but then more people started immigrating to Virginia, and here we go again, different ethnic groups, different religions. So they just kind of kept moving west. But by the time they got to Kentucky and Indiana area, it was different pressures. It wasn't so much the religious pressures as it was stuff like the Civil War amping up and economics and other things like that.
That's helpful. Thanks.
I'm interested in the migration to Africa. That was like 35%. Do you know about when that happened or where in Africa or?
I don't I didn't, I actually, in the research for this book that I'm writing, I learned so much about this country and the atrocities we were doing to people. Everybody thinks that the Swiss people, and it's not all Swiss people, the Swiss government's great because they make really good chocolate, right? They do. But we were never taught anywhere that they were persecuting. I mean, these people were cutting off these people's heads and sending it to their family members. But then I really had to research areas like Pennsylvania and Virginia, and we weren't really nice over here either. I think it's just kind of a human trait if someone's different. So I learned tons, but I had so much research I've had to do that I couldn't really delve into where they were going to other countries because I was just trying to track these families, if that makes sense.
Ellen, I can guess why there are a lot of Mennonites in Africa. You know why? Because there are a lot of Quakers in Africa too. It's because missionaries went out to Africa and converted whole villages. So there
Oh,
are more
wow.
Quakers in Africa right now than there are in the United States, because my branch of Quakerism is not evangelical, but there are evangelical branches in Ohio and Indiana and some of the states who went to Africa, and I bet the Mennonites did the same thing.
Most likely. Most likely. Hi, Kathy.
So do you know how the Mennonites and the Amish get along? I mean, I used to live in Indiana and there were a lot of Mennonites and there were a lot of Amish, and I don't know if you came across any friction or they got along.
No, I didn't in my research. I mean, they're similar, no, more similar in a lot of ways than other religions, right? And so, as are the Quakers. I mean, they're pretty much pacifists. Um, I don't recall seeing anything where any of them, from my research, were having issues with one another. I kind of got the feeling, I could be wrong, they were kind of lumping, banding together because of the fact that they were being so ostracized by other religions. But I didn't see really. I'm sure we're all human, right? There was always some kind of conflict going, but I didn't note anything big.
The reason the Swiss were picking on the Mennonites is because they were pacifists. Is that the main reason, or why were they being discriminated against? Is that
The Swiss were discriminating against them because of their religion.
it's basically their religion? What was so different about their religion that
So the Swiss were, Christians or Catholic, and they was not. I mean, they were just. I mean, I read stories of where, they would imprison some of these Mennonite men for years, giving them like one biscuit every 3 days and water until they submitted or died. They were taking pitchforks in the streets and stabbing them and chasing them. And it was all basically religious orientated, much like, I guess you could compare it in a strange way to Hitler and the Jews. Just absolutely not tolerated. And so when they moved around, every place they moved around in Europe, they'd find shelter in some places and things were okay. But then pretty soon, social and religious stuff from England and other places started pushing them. So they'd move over to the Rhine River area. And then pretty soon, it escalated there. So they were just basically kind of running. Not like constant. They'd settle in each place for a little bit and then.
Can you explain anything about the Mennonite religion? I mean, do they believe in a deity? Do they believe in God? I mean, how are they different from?
So I didn't actually get into the actual religious text of it. For me, on my research, it was more like a lifestyle. So they obviously the obvious things are their dress, right? The way that they interact. They do a lot of rather than singular success, it tends to be familial or group success. They support each other in a community big time. So like if some of them are doing better than others, then they would chip in and help feed the others. Very community based. They did have their worships were a little different. Typically, in some of the churches, like the Ben-Hur house, the men sat on one side, the women sat on the other. At one time, for a majority of the time, formal education for the children was not, a big deal. They were predominantly craft or farming people. They did believe in highly educating their religious leaders who would spend years studying that. But unless you were going to become a religious leader, you would attend basically like a one-room schoolhouse. And you would get, you'd learn how to read and you'd learn how to write, but then it'd come to a point where, okay, now you're going to learn a trade versus going to high school or going on to college. Of course, that changed because now there's a Mennonite college, right? But this is in the beginning. Most don't just attend. By the way, you don't have to be Mennonite to go to that college. So very tight knit, very stay in their community. They often did not venture out unless it was for business from their farming, just because of the ostracization, and their dress gave that away right away. The women obviously tended to do different work than the men did. But I didn't get into their books or texts very much, if that makes sense.
Kathy? You're on mute. You're on mute.
I will unmute. There we go. So I happen to have a friend who was raised Mennonite in Vancouver, BC area.
Hmm.
And so we were just talking about this a couple of days ago, and she's not in a Mennonite congregation as such, but they were raised Mennonite. And so I'm guessing her parents were in the Vancouver area at least by 1950. And then she said the name of the man who started the Mennonite religion, and it kind of sounded like somebody Mennonon. Did you already say that?
No, I actually did not look at the founders of the religion because, again, I tracked these family descendants.
Yeah. And so I was talking about Reformation Sunday, and she said, okay, I'm Lutheran.
It's all good.
And she said that that their leader of their church was around the time of Martin Luther, and so there were changes being made from Catholicism. And one thing that was real important in her religion was they didn't have infant baptism, and so they baptize now older, kind of like when they're at age of reason or high school. That's kind of sounds like an oxymoron sometimes. But that was her take on it. And so she doesn't talk about it a lot, but interesting that these doors open to talk about it, and people aren't being stabbed with pitchforks all the time.
Well, and how do you say this? We're like any other country. We're all human, right? So there's going to be, in our country's early years, even in Yakima, and we're not that old, there's been religious persecutions or racial persecutions. And
Yes.
sometimes the Mennonites, sometimes it almost, when you read it, seems like they were doing a racial one too, even though they're white. But they were just so different looking, so different living than those people around them, that it's almost like I questioned, are you persecuting them in America because of their religion or because of their culture, is probably a better word.
Mm-hmm.
So, unfortunately, I find it ironical that we point our fingers at other countries for atrocities when, much like in World War II with the Jewish concentration camps, and look what we did to the Japanese, but we won't teach that. But we're all human, it happens. You just learn from it and hopefully don't do it again. That's the hope.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Other questions? Okay.
Wow, see, I put everybody to sleep. They missed their dinner. They're going to go to sleep. They're going to say, Ed, don't ask anybody to come anymore.
Thanks, Ellen. We really appreciate this.
No, thank you. It was an honor to share history.
Do you have any idea how large the Mennonite community is in this area now?
I don't. I've always wanted to go to that Hooterite thing every year they have. You can go down there and have in the lower valley. And every year I end up, something happens, I can't go. But next time I visit Central, I'll have to go ask. They would could probably fill me in more.
Oh, what is the Hutterite thing in the lower valley? What,
It's the Hutterites are a lot like the Mennonites and the Quakers. They actually they wear a lot of the same kind of clothing. And in the lower valley, I believe I don't know if it's August or September, they open up their little community and they allow people to come in and have a lunch with them from stuff that they've grown. And I think the Harmon Center, or at least they used to take trips down there once a year to do that. I always thought that would be interesting just to figure it out, but I haven't gotten there yet. But if I find out more, I'll let you know.
All right, thanks, Ellen, very much, and thanks, Ed, for bringing Ellen.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it. Let me just make a quick announcement, and that is that and on December 5th, we are having a festive potluck at Larson Gallery. And you're going to have a chance to enjoy the magic of the Larson Gallery at night with the Central Washington show there. And we're going to be hearing from the Yakima Coffee House poets that night. So it's going to be a fun evening. We hope you can all join us then. And thanks again, Ellen, for being here tonight with us. And thanks everybody for coming. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you, Kathy.
Good to see you too, Ellen.